The Dr. Stone reboot was doomed to fail, and that's coming from someone who has said on record that it's Dr. Stone's best story. But it's hard to ignore the reboot's blatant flaws. The weird thing is that these flaws have nothing to do with the actual quality of the story. No, what sucks about the reboot is that its marketing is an absolute mess. Even though it has this incredible story, Dr. Stone Reboot was basically designed so that it's impossible to market. And Inagaki himself gives you a reason not to read this story. But before I say more on that, I want to just give a quick shout out to Mulkezi for their comment of the week on my last video. If you'd like me to share your comment in the next video, then make sure to share your thoughts on the reboot down below. With that out of the way, let's discuss why the reboot is a marketing disaster. Now, just to be clear, I have no idea what it did for sales. I looked, but I couldn't find anything. I did put out some polls, but we'll get to those in just a minute. First, let me just share my personal experience with other people because I can guarantee it's the same as yours. Before I actually made a video on the reboot, most people I met didn't even know it existed. If I saw you on Twitter and recommended the reboot before its physical volume release, odds are you had no clue what I was talking about. My anime-only friend had no idea there was a reboot. And just the other day I talked with someone who read every single chapter of Dr. Stone, but was genuinely confused when I asked if he had read the reboot. So in my personal experience, there's a bunch of people who don't even know the reboot exists. Which is insane to think about considering Dr. Stone is pretty much a mainstream series at this point. But that's just my personal experience. Here in the Kingdom of Science, we only rely on cold hard facts. So let's take a look at those polls I mentioned. First, we have this poll I placed on my community tab. At 160 votes, 20% of people said they had never heard of the reboot. Now, while I do make a lot of Dr. Stone videos, I also have people who are subscribed for other manga like Eden Zero. So, on its own, this isn't the best frame of reference. That's why I did the same poll on the Dr. Stone Reddit, where it's literally all about Dr. Stone. At 201 votes, 31 Dr. Stone fans said they have never heard of the reboot. So if you ask someone on the Dr. Stone Reddit if they know about the reboot, there is more than a 15% chance they've never even heard of it. Again, it sounds crazy because when you're talking about Dr. Stone fans specifically, you would think that number would be much closer to 0. At least that's what I thought. But I didn't have any real context. So that's why I did 2 more polls on Twitter. One was the same question I've been asking. Another was about My Hero Academia Vigilantes, a prequel for a series that's even more popular than Dr. Stone. Surprisingly, the results were nearly identical. In each poll, only about 10% of people hadn't heard of the prequel. So here's what the polls tell us. If you take a room of 10 manga readers and ask them if they've heard of the reboot, 1 or 2 people will say no. But if you take that same room and ask about Vigilantes, the outcome should be the same. Despite my personal experience, the Dr. Stone reboot seems to be just as well known as other prequels. So then, why is it a marketing disaster? What makes it different from something like Vigilantes? Before I answer that question, don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel and you're enjoying this video. You can expect Season 3 discussions, character analysis videos, arc reviews, and more all in the near future. So now, here's where Inagaki goofed up. And let me just remind you that it was Boichi that wrote this, not Inagaki. So all Inagaki had to do was just say he liked it and tell people to read it. But no, he went one step further. Before, when people were reading the reboot on a weekly basis, there were already theories about how it would tie into the main story. But then in the physical volume, Inagaki goes out of his way to tell you that the reboot is a what-if timeline. Translation, it's not canon. But that's not all. Then Inagaki went on Twitter and said the same thing again. So now he really wants you to know it's non-canon. But then he put a scene in the main story where the characters talk about the ISS, and Senku shoots it down, saying that it would never happen. So on 3 separate occasions, in 3 different ways, Inagaki has gone out of his way to tell people that the reboot is non-canon. And here's why this is just so weird. The truth of the matter is that people care whether something is canon. Ask two One Piece fans whether the sounds Zoro makes in the anime are canon, and they'll fight about it like dogs in heat. Tell a new Naruto fan that certain episodes are filler, and they're probably going to skip right over those episodes. Whether or not something is canon has a huge impact on whether people pay attention to it. Now, in the case of Dr. Stone, there's two light novels that weren't written by Inagaki or Boichi, and as far as I know, Inagaki hasn't said anything about whether they are canon. So readers are free to decide whether these light novels are canon, but for whatever reason Inagaki needed people to know that the reboot was not canon. Which sucks because a lot of people, myself included, really like the story. Does a story need to be canon to be good? No, of course not. But when you read something like Reboot, it's nice to be able to think that it's relevant to the main plot. But nope, Inagaki has effectively made sure that Reboot has zero plot relevance. So right there, you're basically telling people not to read it. Because as good as it might be, if you're trying to decide which anime or manga to start, and someone tells you the reboot has zero plot relevance, then you're gonna pick something else. Now, I get why Inagaki might have done this. He probably wanted to make sure the timeline of Dr. Stone was clear and organized. There are people, myself included, that thought it was because the science in Reboot was closer to science fiction than the main story. But that was before the final arc. At this point, the final arc makes Reboot look like something you could do in your backyard. So it really doesn't make sense why Inagaki didn't just make it so that the final arc could be consistent with the reboot. The only explanation I can think of is that Boichi wrote the reboot after Inagaki had already planned out the ending, so Inagaki didn't want to go back and change everything. Which is fine because in terms of priority, yeah, the main story comes first. But it still doesn't change the fact that it makes the reboot hard to get into. People are busy and their time is valuable, so if you tell them they don't need to read the reboot, then you might as well tell them not to read it. Now, of course, there's other reasons to read the reboot. One of the biggest marketing points is that it's about Byakuya, one of the most universally adored characters in the story, until you get to chapter 5 and suddenly he's a background character. Just so we're clear, I'm not saying this is bad writing. Not at all. In fact, I love when the story focuses on Rei. But I've also read plenty of comments where people complained that they signed up for a story about Byakuya and didn't really get what they were promised. And to an extent, I agree. While the reboot obviously gives context to Byakuya and the space team, it's not entirely about those characters. So if you're on the fence about the reboot, and you're hoping for a story about Byakuya, you're going to be disappointed if you look online and find out it's not all about Byakuya. Right there you have another marketing dilemma, because on the one hand they can tell people it's a story about Byakuya, but on the other hand that selling point comes with a big, fat asterisk. Now, one more point I'd like to make about the reboot is that, again, because of the way Boichi wrote the plot, it makes it incredibly hard to market to casual fans. For example, let's say you're an anime-only fan. First of all, people are going to tell you not to read the prequel until after Season 1 because of Byakuya's backstory. So you might say, okay, I'll wait until after that. You go ahead and binge Season 1, and it was so good you even binged Season 2. But then you go online and find out that you can't read it until after Season 3 because of another Byakuya spoiler. At this point, you've waited way too long and your patience is running pretty low. So the odds that you even remember the reboot after Season 3, never mind bother to read it, aren't really looking so good. And that's part of the reason why you can't really market the reboot to casuals. It's supposed to be a prequel, but you can't even read it until you're halfway through the story. But another reason it's hard to market to casual fans is because of the science used in the story. Again, the final arc makes the stuff in Reboot look like a walk through the park. But what if you're a casual fan that has a hard time following some of the more typical science? If somebody tells you that the characters use MIT rocket science and the story is full of all kinds of math equations, then it's like 50-50 whether you bother to read it. If you like the science and want the challenge, then you might check it out. But if you already have enough trouble following the science in Dr. Stone, then you might not be interested. So while the science in this story is some of the best Dr. Stone has to offer, it kinda ends up being another reason for someone to ignore the reboot before they even give it a chance. Now, at this point, before I close the video, I want to just reiterate that I love the reboot. Boichi is just as talented as Inagaki, if not more, and I will continue to tell you that the reboot is Dr. Stone's best story. But as great as the story is, it's a nightmare to try and market. It's not really made for casual fans. Inagaki went out of his way to give you a reason not to read it, and it has zero plot relevance. So, despite the fact that it's an amazing story with beautiful characters, the Dr. Stone reboot is a marketing disaster. And that's it for this discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, then make sure to like the video. Also make sure to comment with your thoughts down below. And if you'd like more Dr. Stone and other manga discussions like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.